Okay, it is 11:01, so we're going to get started. And welcome, everyone. My name is Deborah Kiak-Franson. I'm the Associate Vice President for Digital Education and Engagement at the University of Colorado System Office in Denver. I'd like to welcome you to number 3 of our 4-part webcast, or our webcast series on high-impact practices and assessing high-impact practices. For those of you who have been on previous webcasts, you'll know that the overall goal of this webcast series is to develop community and to really further conversations about assessing HIPs on our campuses. And as another way to encourage participation in this community, I would love to give a good commercial for the HIPs in the States conference that's going to be held in sunny Southern California in February. More information about that at the end of this webcast, but we encourage you all to submit proposals and actually to recruit co-presenters in the chat during this webcast. So this is how the webcast is going to work. It's being recorded right now. All of your chats are being recorded, as I unfortunately found out after the first webcast that even some of the back channel is recorded. So just so you know that what shows up in that chat will follow you forever. Please do use that chat function to ask questions throughout the webcast. I'll be curating those questions, and at different pauses, different intermissions during the webcast, I'll be asking those questions of our 2 presenters. So the quick synopsis of today's webinar is the use of e-portfolios both as a high-impact practice and as an assessment of other high-impact practices, including itself, I suppose, which is very meta and makes me very happy. What we hope that you'll do is you'll walk away with one immediate action that you can take in the area of assessments and HIPs on your campuses and on portfolios. And what I like about this particular webcast is that we have both the campus perspective and the employment perspective, the employer perspective, all together in one. So it's sure to be a very, very interesting webcast. Please do participate in the chat so that we can have a very vibrant discussion about this. Now, what I'd like to do is, and during the breaks, you'll be asked to do things. So there's no just sitting back and do an email. You'll be asked to participate in activities at different parts during the webcast. And again, thank you all for logging in on the chat. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 2 speakers. We have Maury Baker, who's been in talent measurement for over a decade. He's the Director of Education and Testing Services at PSI, Talent Measurement, a company focused on helping organizations with their people decisions. For the past 2 years, Maury has headed up PSI's newest initiative to help close the skills gap by creating tools and resources that align the next generation workforce with the competencies and behaviors that 21st century employers desire most. Some fun facts about Maury: he was a first-gen college graduate. He started his post-college career as a bail bondsman, and he used to host a sports talk radio show in Salt Lake City, Utah that focused on the NFL and fantasy football. And we also have Dr. Brett Einan, who is Associate Provost at LaGuardia Community College, which is part of the CUNY system, where he guides college efforts related to pedagogy, assessment, technology, advising, and strategic planning. A historian and filmmaker, he's the author of multiple books and articles, including most recently with Randy Bass, From Unbundling to Rebundling: Design Principles for Transforming Institutions in the New Digital Ecosystem. The fun fact about Brett is he's recovering from total knee replacement surgery on both knees and is looking forward to biking and hiking again this fall. So what I'd like to do now, also I forgot a shout out to Ken O'Donnell from CSU Dominguez Hills for creating this whole webcast series, and to the wonderful folks at NASH, the National Association of System Heads, and Rebecca Martin, and they're taking student success to scale initiatives, because their support really helps build this HIPS community across the country. And so now I'm going to turn off and ask Maury to come on and start his video, and take it away, Maury. I think you're on mute, Maury. Hang on.
Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. How are we now?
Good. You got it.
All right. Wonderful. And I think that there's a rolling slideshow that will start here in a moment, correct? Okay, there we go. So I wanted to give a quick background of the company that I work for and how we represent the employer perspective in this webcast. So Performance Assessment Network, or PSI Talent Measurement Division. We are in the talent measurement field. We work with companies, as she said, to help them with their people decisions. Really, we're in assessments, and we do, our catalog has hundreds of assessments, whether it's cognitive ability, non-cognitive, right, computer skills, all the basics. We are SHRM's exclusive partner in assessment and testing, so the Society of HR Management. They have 300,000 members across the globe that are HR professionals, and if they want to do assessments for pre-employment screening or employee development, they go to the SHRM Talent Assessment Center, and that's a rebranded version of our technology, our catalog and products. So on our own as a company, we've been around this division since the year 2000. And today, probably 16,000 employer contacts will use us for that capacity. Probably 20 to 30% use us for post-hire assessments and employee development initiatives, while the other, 70 to 80% use us for pre-hire selection. But we're very experienced in that space. Companies are always coming to us to ask us what's out there to measure what they're looking for. And in recent years, we've noticed a large trend for focusing, companies want the non-cognitive skills. They're trying to focus on ways to measure soft skills. But if you can go to the next slide. So companies will develop a competency model, and a lot of times they'll do it around a specific job or sometimes a career area in general. But they're more focusing on the competencies, behaviors, kind of the soft skills that relate to that job or that field. And then once they come up with their model, they look for assessments on how to measure for those things, and that's where we come in and help them. And then afterwards, we have, if there's not something out in the market that aligns to what they're trying to measure, we have industrial and organizational psychologists that will help them write tools, create tools and assessments, and then do validation studies throughout that process to make sure that they're getting employees that are successful based on the models that they've created and are measuring against. But that's what we do. And in this experience we have, if you want to go to the next slide, it'll show some statistics that you're all familiar with, right? That the large majority of employers perceive a large skills gap, especially when it relates to the soft skills in this younger workforce and outgoing college graduates. While they have a lot of the technical skills needed, their resume looks good, it's that the soft skills is where the gap remains. And the hiring decision during an impressive interview can be largely impacted by a better perception of those skills. So I wanted to show how that focuses on different industries. In the next slide, there's some particular relevance, even in the IT field, which is very hard skill driven. If you have the right IT certification, you're qualified for the job. But this graph here shows IT individuals, and the low, medium, and high with the different color scheme shows the level of maturity of their career, especially as it relates to cloud computing. Having everything in the cloud is relatively new, and that's growing. More companies are doing everything that they do in the cloud. But the more mature in the cloud an IT individual is, this graph shows the more critical soft skills are to the success in their field and in their position. So even in a very hard skill driven area or field, soft skills are still extremely important. And so as we wanted to do some research and to develop something that repurposes the tools and resources that companies are using and try to take that to the workforce development and education space. So in the next slide, we'll show different needs that we've identified that, employers claim there's this gap. So institutions and workforce development organizations, want to engage their learners better, especially as it relates to specific soft skill development, and align those efforts to the needs of those employers. And those that are a little bit ahead of the curve in doing it, many of you may have programs or initiatives at your schools and institutions that focus on soft skills, but sometimes you have a hard time proving it or showing that how the needle is moved with those focus programs. And so we wanted to develop a way where you could measure and track that soft skill proficiency. But everyone wants that better alignment towards college and career readiness, especially as it relates to the soft skill side of things. What will make them more successful students and more successful employees? And then as competency-based learning initiatives grow, schools were looking for a visual way to represent that learning and capacity that students have, especially again as it relates to the soft skills. So those were the problems in the market that we were trying to figure out solutions for based on all that employer perspective that we have. So the next slide shows a solution that we've developed, but what I want to focus on here is the user experience or the student. So companies have been using two main techniques to try to measure soft skill proficiency. There's no perfect measurement other than that first, right, 60 to 90 days on a job. But one of the methods they'll use is a broadband personality assessment, because there are decades of research and scientific data showing that certain personality traits really align well to certain soft skills. So if a student scores high across certain personality traits, they're much more likely to show the behaviors that are associated with certain soft skills or employability skills, right? Those critical workplace competencies. The other method that companies use to try to measure soft skill proficiency is a situational judgment test, where a job candidate or student is presented with a hypothetical scenario, then they're presented with a series of hypothetical responses and ways to react. And then they have to evaluate those reactions based on how effective that would be, right? Is responding that way going to help me, hurt me, or just kind of leave me the same? So what we did in this solution, you'll see it there on the left column, there's an assessment piece, and then the third section is what we call our skill mastery tests. But those are the two techniques that employers have used, right? So the initial assessment, there's a personality test that's used in industry. Millions of people have taken it. Great research showing how it can help predict things like job performance, absenteeism, turnover, etc. And then our skill mastery tests are a series of situational judgment testlets, copying the technique that companies use for those measurements. And then you can see that those are housed around our interactive videos. We've created 16 different soft skills training videos, for lack of a better way to describe it. That same team of IO psychologists that helps companies write all of their content to measure for helped develop these training tools. And so we wrap that all together in a professional readiness platform, and then of course there's reporting and things on the back end. But that's a solution that we've developed that aligns really well to this e-portfolio concept in a way to not only measure and track soft skill proficiency, but then to be able to visually represent that. So I wanted to cover it in a little bit more detail. If you go to the next slide, it shows you the 16 workplace competencies that we've found to be most important to our employers. And you'll see a verbatim match with other models out there, or when you start to break these competencies down by their sub-skills or the key behaviors associated with them, you'll see that it aligns really well to most of the soft skill 21st century concepts that you're used to in the models that you see out there. Things like initiative, planning and organizing, reliability, flexibility or adaptability, etc. But just to give you a better visual, if you want to go to the next slide, when students take that initial personality assessment, we give them 4 reports, and it's all about self-awareness and foundational development. This will show how their personality and strengths naturally align, kind of how they're wired, but also with developmental tips and tricks on what that means for them in context of the world around them. How does their personality fit into different professional settings? What are things they can leverage, but also things they want to be careful of? And then we also give them a report of a general organizational culture fit. Would they likely prefer things like a more informal or a formal culture, a company that's more conventional or traditional versus a company that's innovative, things like that. And then finally, we give them a career interest fit report, very similar to a lot of the products used at your institutions, but we capture all of this from one personality assessment that takes about 15 minutes to complete. But this report here on the screen is what companies are typically looking at as far as a competency report. How do those job candidates normally align? So instead of a report that goes to the companies, we've reauthored them to be directly towards the student or the user, giving them their own personal development and tips as it relates to that awareness about themselves. The next slide shows a little bit of a screenshot related to the soft skills training videos that we've developed. They're animated, they're fun and engaging, they're about 10 minutes long on average, but they're broken down into little 1 to 2 minute bite-sized clips. So students will not only get through them all, but enjoy doing so and want to watch the next one. And there are sample interview questions in these videos, and the videos teach them, hey, now that you're learning about these things, think about times in your own life where you've exhibited these behaviors, so you can start speaking about the fact that you do have these skills, you have put them into practice, and so you can recognize those moments in the workplace when the time comes. And then the third screen, or the next slide, will show an example of the situational judgment tests that we've built into the platform. As I mentioned, there's the hypothetical scenario there at the beginning, and then instead of choosing which response they think is best, they have to evaluate each of those responses based on how effective or ineffective they would be. And again, it's just good practice of situational judgment because more and more companies are using this method as a technique for that next level measurement of skill. If you want to go to the next slide, it just kind of shows the basic development content that permeates throughout the system. We give expanded definition of these skills. What are the key behaviors associated with them? And then again, whether you see that as an area of strength or something that you would like to develop further, we give a series of development tips and then sample behavioral interview questions that help people put context around their experiences and how they align to these otherwise, vague or nebulous skills. Where this all culminates is in the next slide. As you go throughout our platform and these different engagement and development activities, you earn little credentials, and it's visible in what we call your profile. And then you can see those little share icons by different things. Institutions or organizations can do their own branded workflow of activities and tasks and create their own badges or certificates. But then you can share them on social media or through a hyperlink that you could put in an email, and then an internship coordinator or a hiring manager can click on that link and see a public-facing view of your profile, everything that you've achieved. But this is somewhat of a mini e-portfolio, all focused on soft skills related activities and that type of value proposition to the client. But so if we go to the next slide, it's another example of these competency models that not only can employers create them, but schools might have their own competency models, not only around leadership, but we have hundreds of them in our company, because whether it's around nurses or sales positions, you saw cloud computing, leadership in general, there are certain competencies that really align well. And so as students go through development related to soft skills, if they can visually represent progress in these areas and group them together in a way to touch on these models, it will really resonate with employers or anyone evaluating that student, and a big differentiator as they compare with other job candidates, etc. So I just wanted to show how that all ties together, but that's one way that we're trying to tackle this perceived skills gap. We think a lot of your students graduate with the soft skills that they need, but their ability to articulate it is, I think, a larger gap than the reality of a true skills gap there. And so I'm really happy to be part of this webcast as we think of ways to help students articulate that, to visually represent it, not just to the employers, but to themselves, so that their own personal voice grows stronger and their personal brand is something that they can articulate well in those high stakes interview situations. But the next slide has my contact information. I look forward to addressing questions live here in the webcast, but if you have any other questions on how it relates to this content or this topic, I would love to hear from you. Thanks.
That's great, Maury. Thank you very much. What you were just saying has really lit up the chat board. So we're going to do two things first. I'm writing down the questions as fast as I can, but what I'd like you all to do, Maury suggested this question as we were preparing this webcast. And the question is, who came to mind for you as you were listening to Maury speak? Who on your campus, which of your colleagues came to mind where you thought, I really have to talk to this person about what Maury has just presented on? So I'll give you about 30 seconds to type that into the chat. And then I do have the two questions I have from SUNY Special Events and PL Philly. I've got your questions there, and I'll be writing those down right now. Okay, so what we've got is career resources, student development, career development office, and faculty leading capstone. Career services keeps coming up, but faculty senate, there's an interesting one, and department chairs and the owners of the official curriculum. Good. The chair of the undergraduate curriculum committee, director of the career center, even though, and thanks for this, Jen, doesn't believe that employers really want to spend time looking at e-portfolios. Teaching and Learning Center, and here we go, business and industry partners, excellent. Head of our communications department, that's fantastic. And so, Maury, what I'd like to do is just pull you back on for one really brief question. We can probably squeeze a minute into this before we move on to Brett. But I think that some people have already been discussing how this fits. This doesn't seem to fit in a traditional HIP model. And I'm wondering if you can talk about how this fits HIPs.
Well, I think, and someone in the chat touched on it, and I'd just like to call attention to their post. One of, I think, the HIPs is aligning to the stakeholders' feedback or employer needs is what or aligning learning with real world experiences. And this is a real world experience. The whole purpose of at least the product that we developed was flipping that script, right? Giving students exposure to these types of assessments, the type of data gleaned from them, and long before they get hit with it in the workplace. But it's also any type of high impact practice around experiential learning. This is a good way to provide self-awareness, context, and the type of things that they should, the learning outcomes that they should get from those experiences, especially as it relates to the soft skills. So I think that's where it best aligns, again, aligning to real world experience, but then in all of the high impact practices that you have, this next level of awareness, not only of oneself, but the importance of these high impact practices, how it impacts their future. I think this is the type, soft skills and e-portfolios helps them visualize that and reconnect all of those dots to something succinct that they can remember later, refer back to, and then again, learn to articulate in the future as they fill out cover letters, their LinkedIn profile, professional conversations, interviews, etc.
Great, thanks, Maury. And SUNY folks, I do have your NACE Lumina question here noted, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But for right now, I'd like to turn it over to Brett. Brett, if you could come on with your video, and I will go away.
Right, let's see if this is going to work.
You're good.
All right, excellent. So I'm really intrigued by what Maury laid out. And I think in part because it isn't a traditional e-portfolio approach, but I think there's possibilities for those of us who have been working in e-portfolios to think about what we can learn from Maury and how we can integrate the kind of things that he's doing. I think the kind of analytics that we're talking about, some of the game-like qualities, and the ways in which then it's rooted back in some of the same kinds of competencies that many of us have been talking about through AAC&U for the past 10 years. And so I think there's a possibility of a connection that we need to work to try to create. So I'm going to ask everybody to think about that while I sketch a little bit about portfolio practice, and particularly high impact e-portfolio practice. It just kind of lays some groundwork here about what portfolios are and how they work and what we know about them. So Ken, can we move forward? All right, so just to start with the real basics, what is a portfolio? A portfolio is one of the things that people very often start with is think of it as a technology, but it's really more of a pedagogy or a practice than a technology. It's a way that students collect and examine, document, and reflect on their learning. And that learning ideally is taking place not just in a single course, but across multiple courses, across semesters, linking multiple high-impact practices, connecting beyond the boundaries of the classroom to the co-curriculum and to the world of work and community. Portfolios are used in all sorts of ways. About 50% of the colleges in the country are using them. They support, in addition to that direct focus on what students are learning, increasingly now there's more and more effort to build in educational and career development planning, to support advisement, and of course to support assessment. One of the major functions of portfolios is the way in which they collect the artifacts of student learning that allow us to make authentic assessment possible. Bottom line is that portfolios work on all these levels to deepen student, faculty, and institutional learning. Go ahead, Ken. So if we're trying to think about how to sum that up, in a single sentence, we might say that e-portfolios are a set of practices that make learning visible and engage that visibility to advance growth and deepen integrative learning across boundaries. So let's go ahead and think about then, let's drill down a little more, Ken. So one of the things that I've been part of for the past few years is trying to understand what makes ePortfolio work. What is it, is it a high impact practice? What kind of impact does it have? And as with all high impact practices, what does it mean to do it well? So we've been working with a range of institutions. I've been working with institutions around the country for the past 10 years in various forms. And in particular, a set of 24 campuses from around the country that gathered information to document the impact of ePortfolio and to document the kind of practices that generated high impact. And as we studied it, we came up with 3 key propositions. One, that when done well, ePortfolio practice advances student learning and success. We'll talk about that more in a minute. 2, that by making student learning visible, it supports not only student success as measured by progress towards the degree, but also a level of integration and deep learning. And 3rd, that the impact on learning is not limited to students. There's also a process of helping institutions focus on student learning and improve their practice. So moving towards becoming learning organizations. Go ahead. So I did my shameless plug for my recent book with Laura Gambino. And all this is laid out in greater detail there. But a key piece of what we uncovered in the book is the evidence that portfolios actually can be shown to measurably improve student performance. And LaGuardia has been gathering data on this for many, many years. This is some data from a particular year in the last 5 or 6 years, where we were looking at comparing portfolio sections of courses with sections of the same courses that were not using portfolios. And we were looking at student outcomes around course completion, around pass rates, high pass rates, meaning students are in good academic standing, and next semester retention. And on each count, we saw that students in classes that were using the portfolios were much more likely to be successful and to move forward towards graduation. So we have year after year of this data. For many years, LaGuardia was one of the few places that was gathering this kind of data. But fortunately, as we'll see in the next slide, that now there's more and more other institutions that have gathered similar data. So this is some data from from San Francisco State, looking at their innovation called the Metro Health Academy. They were working with at-risk students in learning communities and connecting them with portfolios and kind of a career development process, and comparing that to students who they're normal incoming students. And they found that those students in the Metro Academy were doing much better in terms of retention, 1-year retention, 3-year retention, and beyond, all the way to graduation. You might quickly, say, if you're thinking about that, but to what extent is that the impact of the portfolio? It's a learning community. It's another high impact practice. It's, intensive advisement. It's a guided pathways model. And that's absolutely right. I mean, part of what we see is that very often ePortfolios are implemented along with high impact practices. And it's hard sometimes to distinguish what's the impact of which innovation. The next slide, though, gives us a little bit of an insight into that. And this is from Queensborough College here in CUNY. And they were having retention problems in their first year with their first-year students. And they were having retention at about 65% of their students. They introduced a learning community, the first-year academy, and they saw that had a dramatic impact in terms of improving retention. But in some sections of those learning communities, the first-year academies, they incorporated ePortfolio, and there the impact was even greater. So this gives us some sense, and this is part of what we saw was over and over again at institution after institution, the presence, the sophisticated use, the ePortfolio practice done well correlated with improved student outcomes around the most concrete measures. Go ahead. So if that's one level of impact. If students are moving forward and progressing, which is of course really crucial, particularly in an institution like mine, but probably at most of our institutions, are they actually learning? And what we found was that e-portfolios not only help students move ahead, but it helps them deepen their learning by making their learning visible, that it allows them to reflect on their learning and to make connections that support a deeper learning process. So our students, go ahead, Ken. Our students have been telling us this for years. So if you talk to students or read what students write about portfolios, they tell us over and over again about how portfolios affect them. So this is a quote from one of our students here at LaGuardia, Rezwana Islam, in which she talks about how the portfolio helped me to see a new me, the potential I have as a student, and what I want to accomplish in my life. And I love that sense of, thinking about a new sense of self. And that, I think, is one of the most powerful things about portfolios, is because they help students connect what they're learning in their classrooms to the rest of their life experiences. It helps them integrate their learning into a new sense of self, what Marcia Baxter Magolda talks about as purposeful self-authorship. And that, I think, is something that very much connects to the kinds of things that Maury was talking about. Go ahead. We've been gathering this qualitative data for years. In the Connect to Learning project that I was referring to, we did a survey to try to document this on a quantitative level. We got a nice N of about 10,000 students, and we asked them a lot of different questions, but these are some samples that look at what students have to say about the portfolio experience and how they think their ePortfolio enhanced courses were affecting them. So on the first level, you can see that overwhelming majorities agree or strongly agree that the portfolio experience helped them make connections between ideas, help them think more deeply about the course content, and help them be more aware of their growth and development as a learner. Similarly, the bottom set of questions suggest that these are drawn from the NESI and from the deep learning scale of the NESI, and that these are indications that the course, kind of another angle in, that the ePortfolio course was helping to build critical thinking, help students apply theories or concepts to practical problems in new situations, and of the core of integrative learning. And the slide is a little cut off there, but the course contributed to my knowledge, skills, and ability to understand myself in new ways. So this gives us some quantitative data that backs up that qualitative data and suggests that students are engaged in a process of thinking deeply about what they're learning and changing their sense of self. And that, I think, is what we're excited about in terms of portfolios, and where we might go in terms of thinking about how to take advantage of the kinds of tools that Maury's developing. Go ahead. So this last data slide, I just thought is interesting to see for a number of reasons. This looks at, we asked students, as we said, a lot of questions. And one set of questions we asked was, is anybody looking at your portfolio? Is anybody commenting on your portfolio? And Helen Chen from Stanford University did some analysis of that data and broke students out into students that were getting high levels of feedback from peers and students who are getting low levels of feedback from peers. And what we saw was that when students are getting high levels of feedback, they're much more likely to value what the portfolio is offering and to see it as really helping them move forward. And this is, the difference is stunning here between the orange, the low levels of feedback, and the blue, the high levels of feedback. But this is particularly interesting because it's really actionable data. It suggests the difference, that the impact of portfolios is very different depending on how we implement them. So here, the implication being clearly, we need to think about a social pedagogy, a way of ensuring that students are getting feedback on their portfolios, that they know that others are looking at them and engaging with them through the portfolio. And I think this is also kind of suggests some of the kinds of things that Maury is talking about in terms of the ways in which students will come to value their learning and the reflective process. Go ahead, Ken. So that's a quick look at the impact, but it also begins to suggest the difference that it makes in terms of the type of practice. And ePortfolio is not simply a plug and play tool. It's a tool that we need to think carefully about how we use. We need to think about the pedagogy in our classrooms or in our advisement processes, the professional development processes that can help faculty, staff, advisors, peers use portfolios well, the outcomes assessment that can help us take advantage of it as an institutional learning goal, and then what kinds of technologies will actually support that. And the final sector here that we point to, scaling up the kinds of institutional supports required to make ePortfolio successful. So I always want to be very clear, portfolios don't just do themselves. It's something you have to think carefully about as a faculty member and as an institution in order to make it effective. Let's go to the last slide, Ken. So thinking about the question of career development, and I saw somebody in the chat talking about, well, my career center doesn't think that employers will look at portfolios. And our experience is mixed in that regard. That we've done a bunch of focus groups and asked employers about it, and some are quite open to it and others are not. But in general, what we found is that it's true, they're not going to see it as a replacement for the resume. Resume is a really effective tool. You can look at, I know that I can look at a resume and in 30 seconds and say, bum, 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 okay, this is what I need to know about this person. But that employers are more likely to look at the portfolio in a later stage of the interview process. As they're actually talking to students, both employers and our students tell us, oh, yes, then I had the opportunity to show them my portfolio. Perhaps more importantly, even if the student never shows the portfolio, I think that the portfolio can help students prepare for the interview process and for employment in a number of ways. One, by helping them identify and pursue their career goals and plans, to think carefully about where they want to go, what they want to do, and why, and how they're going to get there. Secondly, it helps them think about their strengths, their abilities, their capacities, and what they have to offer in a job interview process. Our students talk about, when we've interviewed students about this, that it's almost like they've rehearsed for the interview by building their portfolio. They know more clearly who they are and what they're bringing to the table. And I think that links to this, both of those points link to this sense of emerging professional identity. I think we've got some real work to do to more explicitly build in the kinds of tools that Maury is demonstrating here, and to more explicitly think about the ways in which what we understand as core competencies, student learning outcomes, the 21st century learning skills identified by AAC&U, how those actually link to the kinds of skills and capacities that employers need. And in so doing, help students understand and value what they're doing in their educational process. So I pose that as a challenge to all of us. How can we do that? How can we do that well? What are our steps to pursuing that process?
Great. Thank you, Brett. And you've just given a new engagement question than the one we have developed. What are the next steps for you with ePortfolios? How can you take that one next step on your campus at your institution to move us toward this ideal where the ePortfolios are showing dispositional learning, showing evidence of those 21st century skills? So I'll give you just about 30 seconds, maybe a minute, to type that in the chat. And thank you, everyone. The chat is hopping so much that we're developing other back channels so we can keep track of everything. So thank you very much. And then Brett and Mari, I'm going to have you come both of you come on video and audio, and we're going to have one of our participants. Now I've lost her. Ask one of the questions that came up in the that came up in the chat. But let's see what people are saying about those next steps. What can you do? And this is the awkward silence while people think and type at the same time.
So are we waiting for a question, or are we addressing one of Jillian's questions from the...
You will in just 1 second. She'll re-ask it because it's just too hard to find in the chat. But
yep. Right now is the reflection question you just asked. Everyone
exactly.
is thinking and entering responses. My bad.
Exactly. Oh no, that's okay. That's okay. So we've got one suggestion as a subset of the e-portfolio could be what to bring to the interview, work samples, etc. So start to build in more structure or additional structure into the portfolio itself. And how do we create a culture where feedback is considered the most important tool? So, and that goes back to one of Brett's slides that show the incredible gains just from getting feedback from peers. Helping faculty explore the linkage between learning skills and employer skills. And then there's one from El Reed or Iriad, which sounds like a Game of Thrones name, but I'm sure it's El Reed. And so a bunch of questions there that I'll let you look at. But right now, let's go over to Jillian to re-ask your question of these two, because that gives us a nice bridge into the dialogue we're going to try to get these two to engage in.
Okay, I've worked with Brett before on his project that he mentioned earlier. And as a teacher who teaches an e-portfolio course, I do have students focus on the soft skills and on thinking about how they can showcase those soft skills for employers. But I'd be very interested to hear from Maury about, what he might see in a student portfolio that would demonstrate to him that a student has flexibility, that a student can be a team player. I'm just curious whether, what I think as a teacher matches up with what an employer might potentially, sort of have their interest piqued by.
Yeah, that's a really good question, because to me, one of the biggest, and I think those of you that have dug deeper into e-portfolios and studied their use and used them, it goes way deeper than this. But a simple representation, right, whether they create a little icon related to teamwork or whatever the competency is, that then is a trigger for discussion. Now, if they have some type of accompanying work or a quick synopsis, a paragraph that explains their experience, with teamwork or why they, because like you said, how do they show it right there? Other than some type of visual to trigger the question, or if they're asked a question, I think you mentioned, or a couple people, Cindy maybe, that, hey, bringing an e-portfolio to an interview, which shows great preparation, forethought by the student. But if they have something that they can refer to when they're asked a question, how they speak about it, I think is more important. So the reflection exercises that they've just gone through as a natural progression in creating it might help more, because it is difficult to just simply visualize it and visualize it in a way where everyone who looks at it thinks that, oh, that's what that means, or I recognize that as being a value. As many of you have said, it's a 50-50. Some employers don't want to take the time to go look at an e-portfolio as a screening item, certainly not in the beginning. But just the fact that it's there and students are better prepared to discuss, to articulate teamwork, right? Anytime they're asked a question about teamwork, they have this e-portfolio content that they can speak to, or even if it's not in front of them, they much better know how to, articulate things, talk about them in the context of their own experiences, because they had to intentionally think about that as they created an e-portfolio to visualize it.
Great, thank you. And I think your point about experiential learning, earlier, a lot of times students learn some of these things outside the classroom. They might learn teamwork on a playing field or being part of a theater ensemble. They don't necessarily think of that when they're putting together a resume. So,
Right.
And I think it's that question of explicitly pulling out what it is that they're developing and understanding that this is part of what employers will value. And then in order to do that, faculty have to understand that. Faculty have to have conversations that look for that kind of interplay between here's what we value in what our classrooms, and here's what employers value, and how does this start to line up? That is more than just kind of the accretion of knowledge. That's really that capacity building process.
Excellent.
Yeah, and that methodology, connecting dots, that's habit forming, right? The more faculty are going through that exercise, hey, think about how this relates. What are other ways in your lives where you've shown teamwork, right? Have you worked in a theater ensemble? The more you exercise in thinking through those things, the more that creates a habit with those students where they start connecting those dots on their own, even when they're not guided. But if there's not that guidance there to help teach them those habits, it may not take them as far as you would like.
That's right. And I think that, this fits with a lot of what we see. If you think about, Ken and George Koo's article about, kind of the behaviors associated with high impact practices. These are exactly the kind of behaviors that we want students to engage in that will help them build these capacities. But we need to help them draw out explicitly what they're getting in that regard. And the reflexive process, I think, is the appropriate venue for doing that. But that won't just happen by itself. That's where it takes thoughtful educators to intervene and guide that process.
Great. Thank you, Jillian, for making an unexpected entry into the webcast. We appreciate it and appreciate your question. And now what we're going to try to do is start to build this bridge between the academic side and the employment side. And so, Brett, one question I had from you, and I'm going to get off, and Jillian will get off, and it'll just be the two of you building a metaphorical bridge and visual. But Brett, if you could start with answering the question, do any of your students and alumni report using their e-portfolios in job applications or in interviews? And you've touched on this a little bit, but what artifacts in those e-portfolios seem to be the most helpful, so that if we're thinking about how to get students to do this, what should we focus on? And I'll get out of the way and let you two talk.
Well, I think the two things that come to my mind. One is that students do report using the portfolios for interviews with employers, but also in a case of a community college, equally important is for transfer. And that is particularly true when they're applying, say, from our system, into a more a private college or an elite college. And then the portfolio is a chance for them to show what they've learned. In both cases, I think that it's key that it has to line up with some of the particular interests of the audience, but it can't be something that is so dense and so kind of arcane that the audience can't understand it, the interviewer or the transfer representative. So visual artifacts, artifacts that show depth but can be quickly grasped, artifacts that then are attached to a reflection that helps students, make explicit what they're getting out of it. So I think that it's, kind of shifting away. It has to have real content, but it can't be limited to the content. It has to kind of speak to that higher order thinking capacity or, soft skills, whatever language we want to use on that. So I don't know, Maury, what's your thought about that?
Yeah, I think regardless of where they use it, we also need to help them understand that because they attach an e-portfolio to their resume or their college application, that doesn't magically lock them in, right? It's not going to get them the job. They need to understand what it means, what it represents, and how to speak to that. But as we've talked about, just the exercise of building it, going through it, helps with that so much. The other thing I was thinking about, though, is in all of these contexts, whether it's a college application and a transfer, whether it's an internship or a job, in every aspect of that type of situation, we're looking for a competitive advantage. We're looking for a differentiator to help me stand out. But I do venture to say that my resume will be better, my cover letter will be better. Even if I'm not attaching my e-portfolio, the experiential learning I've had going through that process is going to permeate the way I communicate about myself, and not only, verbally, but in everything I write, everything I structure and do. I've realized the value, I've connected those dots, and that's just going to show. But yeah, as long as they understand the value, all we're really looking for is a way to differentiate them in a positive way. And an e-portfolio is guaranteed to do it at whatever level it's applied.
Yeah. I think the other thing is that I would love for us to think about is how could some of the kind of metrics that your platform your platform visualizes in certain ways the metrics associated with the development of those skills. And that's something that I think it lends itself to representing, okay, here I've done these things, and is a good conversation starter. So I think it's a combination of the artifacts, the reflections, and then finding some way to represent the accumulation, to visually represent the accumulation of those skills. So that's one of the things I'd like to learn from you about how to do that.
Yeah, and again, there's no perfect measurement. It's an inexact science, but as I explained in the presentation, we're trying to build in the two techniques that companies use for that measurement piece as a predictive indicator, right? Because there's just no substitute for that observance on the job. Yeah. But yeah, the metrics, a metric on a personality test doesn't really change a whole lot year over year. It might change from a freshman to a senior because you've gone through so much life-changing development. But when it's really just gauging how your personality is, right? How are you predisposed? You may always be predisposed to make quick decisions. You think quickly and you're a gunslinger when it comes to pop, pop, pop. But throughout your professional and academic experience, you've learned when you need to slow a process down, right? Take a decision through an analytical process. And a personality test will never show it because you're still wired one way. But then those situational judgment tests provide those, measurements, those analytics on, can I recognize a need for something in a given moment and apply my knowledge in that? And that's not a perfect measurement either, but it gives you these outcomes to base decisions on and show a progression. And again, just the exercise helps students connect the dots between, these moments when this nebulous soft skill or competency is discussed or required, and then how do I have it, right? Do I have value to offer here related to this thing that this employer is thinking about?
Yep.
So this is Deb. I'm going to jump in with a question that seems to almost summarize a lot of the discussion that's been happening in the chat. And it is, and a shout out to SUNY Special Events number 2. Does this suggest that structured reflection is the highest impact thing we're doing?
I would say it's crucial to the high impact things we're doing. And one of the things that you see is that it recurs and helps link up all the other high impact things we're doing. So in that sense, I think it is absolutely essential as a piece of all of our high impact practices. Absolutely.
I think it determines how high the impact goes.
Yes.
Right? If there's an impact meter that shows the level of impact for each of those practices, the more structured reflection, there'll be a direct correlation. with how impactful it truly is.
Yep. There you're a true Deweyan, Maury.
Yes, the as Carolyn Coward calls it, the impact-o-meter. So that's fantastic. And
I like it.
so I've got a question for you, Brett, because we're talking now about the impact-o-meter going up with structured reflection, but you also contend that it goes up pretty high with feedback. How do you structure that feedback, and how do you give students and faculty the tools necessary to provide effective feedback for the portfolios?
Sure. Well, I think very often we think about reflection as this process where we go into the room and shut the door and turn off the lights and, shut our eyes, and somehow brilliant thoughts come to us. But in fact, reflection, and we've drawn a lot from the work of Carol Rogers about Dewey, and she posits 4 different aspects to effective reflection. And one of them is a reflection in community, that the interaction with others in a reflective process can be really powerful. But any form of reflection, I think Maury used the term structured reflection, or the questioner used that term, I think requires structure. If we just say to students, "Oh, so what did you think?" or "How did you feel?" or "How was that?" you're going to get not very little back, and that it takes thoughtful connection between the particular experience that you're examining and the larger goals you're trying to, or capacities you're trying to build, that the reflective prompt needs to keep both of those in mind. And what it takes to do that is practice, learning from others, professional development, doing things as a faculty member or an advisor that helps students do that, and then says, "Oh, did that work well? Oh, well, that question, I thought that question was going to be a great question, but actually it fell flat." So I believe that this is part of where portfolios only work if faculty are learners as well. Very few of us actually grew up in classrooms in which we were asked to reflect. We weren't taught how to do that. We didn't grow up thinking that that's part of what teaching and learning was about. So for us, this is something that we need to learn, and it takes help in that process. And so somebody talked about Centers for Teaching and Learning here. I think the involvement of Centers for Teaching and Learning and career centers and their collaboration can be really valuable in the kind of effort we're talking about here.
And so this is Deb again, and the chat is hopping so much that all I can do is get this question from memory, and I apologize for it. But it's for both of you, but probably a little bit more for Maury. Someone was asking, if I recall, what is the evidence that students have after the fact? So are they, as they are employed, do you have any evidence that they are using the soft skills that they claim to have used when they've built their portfolios? Does that make sense? So we've talked about the educational piece, the reflection of that, connecting to that interview and that first work situation. What evidence do we have after that those skills they learned and are reflecting on and providing artifacts for, that they're actually using?
Yeah, and I think that question was targeted towards one of the peers who had also posted a message about, how often the students had used their e-portfolios to get a job, and the question, hey, did you connect with them to see if they were still using it, or, what outcomes? But as many people on the webcast know, the outcome survey, just to learn what a student's first destination was, can sometimes be a huge challenge, much less that deeper dive into use. Where we show evidence isn't from the students themselves, but the reason that these thousands of employers across the nation use these types of assessments even early in a pre-hire situation, but certainly 20 to 30% of the employers use it post-hire to continue that engagement and development. It's because of how it contributes to the retention of that employee and the advancement within that company. It saves the company tons of money in not having to retrain people, and then having an employee who's engaged and progressing within the company. And so it's a natural evidence, of the evolution of the practice, because companies will do validation studies later, as I mentioned. Are we getting the employees we expected to get from this measurement tool? Are we seeing a decrease in turnover, right? And whether that's an employee self-selecting out because they weren't as engaged or satisfied because the fit wasn't there, or is it that the company terminated the employment because they really weren't prepared, they didn't have the skills necessary. And as we see those numbers increase, that ROI that the companies show, that's the biggest evidence we have. But I don't know of feedback or a feedback mechanism from the students themselves to confirm that they have continued to use those skills or practices in the workplace.
Okay, thank you.
Other than all of our own life experiences tell us that
Right.
they become more critical as we go.
That's wonderful. So I'd like to do a little crowdsourcing exercise right now, because this popped up from, I believe it's Susan Taylor, who asked the question, how long after graduation can students typically keep using their university-based e-portfolios to keep building them post-graduation? And we've got information about D2L now and Folio Tech. If other people have different e-portfolio systems that they're using, could you please put in the chat what the longevity of those e-portfolios is? And then Brett or Maury, if you have any experience with one or more of the e-portfolio systems, if you could chime in as well and just let us know.
Well, just quickly from our experience, we work with Digication, and at this point, Digication and most portfolio companies now are going to the strategy of allowing students lifelong access. It's just the issues of archival space have really dwindled. It used to be everybody was concerned about how we're going to store all this. That seems to be much less of an issue now, and so it's increasingly common on most platforms that students get to have the portfolio as long as they want it.
Great.
Yeah, even if our own product is not an e-portfolio, right? I showed you the profile that they have. It doesn't have nearly the content that the systems you're talking about will have. But I know we give candidates, students access to their results, not only their achievements in the profile, but also their results from the assessments in perpetuity. Right, even once they're past time, even if a school's license would have expired, that the individuals always have access to their results, and I think you'll see that more and more.
Yeah, I think so too.
Great, thank you. I'm going to do another, and Carolyn has another question for everybody, and I think that's more of a crowdsourced question than a Brett Maury question. But what I'd also like you to do is, we're just going to do a little engagement question again. What I'd like you all to do is think of a HIP, any HIP that's not an e-portfolio, and then think about how the use of an e-portfolio could provide specific evidence of learning or skills acquired in that HIP. So if you can do that, and Brett and Maury, as they're typing their answers, if you could answer that question, what's your favorite non-e-portfolio HIP? And how can an e-portfolio show evidence of learning? And so of course now you have to go back to the original 10.
Right. Right. Well, there's so many powerful high impact practices, and whether we're talking about first year seminars, first year experiences, or capstone courses, or internships, or undergraduate research, our faculty at LaGuardia are using portfolios in all those settings. Some of the most exciting stuff, we're doing a lot of work now in our STEM fields, and so the undergraduate research work where students are collaborating with faculty in the classroom on, kind of research in the classroom and on larger research projects, documenting their findings collaboratively, very often with the faculty, creating a shared portfolio, and posting the data, posting the results, but also reflecting on the process and what are they getting out of it. So that to me we've seen, for our students, moving into STEM is challenging. It's a big issue, for low income and minority students, and developing what we talk about as STEM identity, developing some sense that they belong, that they can do, research, that they can do science, is a big hill to climb. And the portfolio seems to really help them make their progress in that explicit, where they start to think about themselves as scientists. And so that may be the one I would highlight right now.
Yeah, and I'm biased, right? Coming from the market, internships just seem to be so impactful. I know those internships might be one of the practices that's the hardest to execute upon, for the masses. But every time one is implemented, it benefits all parties involved. But I always see that as the point where, if that student hasn't connected the dots between, and you talked about building confidence, maybe seeing gaps, but really seeing how it connects to the future world of work, right, that they're going to be in. And when we know we need to focus on helping them become learners, right? But I think they start to see that need in the internship more strongly than any of the other HIPs they might be involved in.
I think the other one that, I say, first year experience programs. In our book, we saw a new book that I'm working on right now, the kind of use of portfolios in first year seminars is really widespread now. And I think it helps students make that transition from high school to college, or from wherever they're coming to college, and think about why they're there, think about what they're learning, and kind of, again, that process of, I'm becoming a college student. And for some of our students, that's a huge step. So that again and again, I see this linkage between the learning process and the identity formation process, whether that's in first year, capstone, undergraduate research, career, internships, all those kinds of things. Places where students can extract that meaning out of it and really have a transformative experience.
I can't thank the two of you enough. We're going to have to wrap up now. I'm sure hoping you'll be out in sunny Southern California in February. We've got lots of good questions in the chat. I don't know how we're going to capture those and get answers to those, but we'll figure it out. In the meantime, I have two final wrap-up questions for our viewing audience, and it's going to go really fast. The first one is, it's Tuesday. You've put away your white shoes and your white pants because Labor Day has passed. Unless you're in the Deep South, I'll give you a bye there. But what do you remember? No more than 3 words. What do you remember from this next Tuesday? You have 30 seconds. Double knee replacement is something somebody remembered. Okay, so another 3 words. What will you remember next Tuesday? And then the second question is, what's one commitment you're going to make to, oh my gosh, process, not product, reflection, reflection, reflection. Fantastic. What's one thing you're going to do differently, either this afternoon, because you still have a couple hours before the Labor Day weekend, or next Tuesday? What's one thing you're going to do differently? One person you're going to contact, one person you're going to talk to based on this. And since I've got a minute left, I'm also going to say, please contact the people who have been on this webcast. We haven't heard a lot today about HIPs. We've talked a lot about soft skills and e-portfolios. You should know that presentation proposals are due 1 month from today, and we all want to show that HIPs do more than just make students persist. They also help and improve learning. We want to know what you're doing, and we'd like you to come in February and tell us. So a huge round of applause, Brett and Maury. I don't know if you all will be there in California.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's a great It's a great place to be. You're selling me on it, that's for sure.
All right, good. All right, well, we hope we continue to sell because we would really like you to be available to the people who have watched you on this webinar and who have engaged in so many ways. And I'm loving what I'm seeing here. So I'm going to talk to the director of Center for Teaching and Learning, share some ePortfolio resources with the capstone students, share with my boss, share with the pathway coordinators. Once again, Brett and Mari, you guys were fantastic. And once again, the audience, you've just outdone yourselves with the engagement.
Absolutely.
And I very much appreciate it. And round of applause. And we hope to see you all soon.
It's a
Thank
pleasure.
you. All right.
Thanks for letting me be a part of it.
Oh, thank you. Yay.
Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.